One, and you're live.
Good morning, Summa Scholars. Today is May 29th in Eastertide. And let's go. What's up, Joe?
What's up, man?
Today is page 213, question 19, article 4. Whether the will of God is the cause of things. Top of the page. Objection 4 from whoever the hell it is. Further, one thing there is, one cause. But the cause of created things is the knowledge of God, said before. Therefore, the will of God cannot be considered the cause of things. This is the wrong opinion. Here comes Thomas with the correct opinion. On the contrary, it is said, wisdom, in the book of wisdom, how could anything endure if thou wouldst not? I answer that we must hold that the will of God is the cause of things, and that he acts by the will, and not, as some have supposed, by a necessity of his nature. Thomas wants us to see that God is free. Illustrative in this can be the thing that has filtered into society, that there's a difference between license and freedom. Just because you can do whatever you want does not mean that is freedom, because sometimes the things you want are not good. And when you do the things that are not good, that is against your nature and ends up causing you sorrow and pain. And that is not freedom, that is bondage and slavery. And Thomas wants you to see that God is doing everything he does out of directed to the telos of goodness, or the good, that his will is directed towards the good, and that he is free to do that, because that is true freedom. So what God is doing in complete freedom, and that he has no necessity to create or share himself with us. This can be shown in three ways. First, from the order itself of active causes. Since both intellect and nature act for an end, as proved in physics, the natural agent must have the end and the necessary means predetermined for it by some higher intellect. As the end and definite movement is predetermined for the arrow by the archer. Hence, the intellectual and voluntary agent must precede the agent that acts by nature. Hence, since God is first in the order of agents, he must act by intellect and will. All this stuff builds off the 5 ways of Thomas, and that the arrow flies according to the will and intellect of the archer, so flies everything else. There is a complexity, though, that comes with humans, because the human is part of God's will, and part of God's desire for us is that we should not, that the arrow flying, just picture within the arrow flying that there is a mechanism by which the arrow itself can decide the length, or its, or the head of the arrow's orientation, or the fletching can decide its movement, but the general trajectory of the arrow is arrow-like. It has an arrowness quality about it. God has given us the ability to change, grow, and hit the mark more or less perfectly. Nevertheless, the arrow will still fly to the target. It may not perfectly hit the center of the target. It may be off center. It may be way off center. And God forbid, the arrow could choose to land in the thorns or in the fire that's burning beside it, if it so chooses. But that is the actual will of the archer, that it should fly thus. This is shown, second, from the character of a natural agent, of which the property is to produce one and the same effect. For nature operates in one and the same way, unless it be prevented. This is because the nature of the act is according to the nature of the agent, and hence, as long as it has that nature, its acts will be in accordance with that nature. For every natural agent has a determined being. Since then, the divine being is undetermined, and contains in himself the full perfection of being, it cannot be that he acts by a necessity of his nature, unless he were to cause something undetermined and indefinite in being. And that this is impossible has already been shown by question 7, article 2. He does not, therefore, act by a necessity of his nature, but determined effects proceed from his own infinite perfection according to the determination of his will and intellect. Third, it is shown by the relation of effects to their cause. For effects proceed from the agent that causes them, in so far as they pre-exist in the agent, since every agent produces its like. We've already gone through all this stuff. Joe's produce little Joe's. Well, little Joe's Mary Kate's, but everything produces the thing to its effect. Me playing guitar produces the song in the way in which I play it, which is different than the way Bob Dylan would play it or something like that. Now, effects pre-exist in their cause after the mode of the cause. That which is contained by the mode of the container, and that which is affected or caused also proceeds according to the mode of the cause. Therefore, since the divine being is his own intellect, effects pre-exist in him after the mode of intellect, and therefore proceed from him after the same mode. Consequently, they proceed from him after the mode of will, for his inclination to put in act what his intellect has conceived appertains to the will. Therefore, the will of God is the cause of things. All of this is just saying that that our intellect and our will is created in the image and likeness of the deity. That's why yesterday I said he used an argument from authority, and the argument from authority was the nature of man. Now that we work according to the counsel of will, we do not will necessarily. Therefore, God does not will necessarily whatever he wills. He's using humanity as an argument from authority, but remembering that we are created in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, he's showing this pattern. But God's way of being, intellect and will, is one. That his intellect, his will, and again, we're going to see what he has to say about the divine, about the Holy Trinity when we get to the Trinity, and these things will become more and more elucidated as we proceed. Replying to objection 1, Dionysius in these words does not intend to exclude election from God absolutely, but only in a certain sense, insofar that is, as he communicates his goodness not merely to certain things, but to all, as election implies a certain distinction. God's will, God's goodness is the original mover and sustainer of all things, but his goodness in the human person acts with restraint, with allowing us to have freedom in the way in which we, in our end goal or our telos, we have freedom in creating ourselves with God. Not true with all the heavenly bodies that move completely according to his will, as the famous saying from St. Francis, Lord, you command the bird to sing and it sings. You command the flower to give off sweet smell and it gives off sweet smell. And you command us to love, and alas, we do not love. Reply to objection 2. Because the essence of God is his intellect and will, from the fact of his acting by his essence, it follows that he acts after the mode of intellect and will. The divine essence is intellect and will in a unified. When we see ourselves, the intellect and will is clearly split. Also, they war against one another. That which I will to do, I do not do, and that which I would do, that I don't do. We are in a state of warfare within ourselves, and in that warfare, as we've said, some things enter into us from the outside and affect us, and some things come from within and move outward. And we are also doing that to each other all the time. And so when the intellect and will is at war with each other, that war produces effects that move out to your family. and wound your family, wound your children, and then that wound carries on, and then the wounds can proliferate and turn into a wounded society, and finally society wars against another society, and then that's when you have what we call war. But it's all warfare. But as opposed to Cormac McCarthy's premise in Blood Meridian, where he tries to say everything is war. That's what Judge Holden is trying to say. Everything is war. True, everything is war in this broken state that we are in, but some have triumphed over that. We call them saints. Go read the lives of the saints to see how a well-ordered life is lived, and you do not have to submit to Judge Holden's premise. You are free to not by grace. Reply to objection 3. Good is the object of the will. The words, therefore, because God is good, we exist, are true inasmuch as his goodness is the reason of his willing all other things, as said before. Goodness is the first cause and the final cause of all things, but there is permitted to be holes in the paper. There's admitted lack of being, which we call evil. That is permitted, but at one point in the future, these things will all be rectified. There will be tikkunim made, rectifications of all these things. And that which is complete darkness will be in complete darkness, and that which is light will be in complete light. That city, the New Jerusalem, has no need of the sun, for the Lamb of God is the light thereof. Reply to objection 4. Even in us, the cause of one and the same effect is knowledge as directing it, whereby the form of the work is conceived, and will is as commanding it, since the form as it is in the intellect only is not determined to exist or not to exist in the effect except by the will. Hence, the speculative intellect has nothing to say to operation. But the power is cause as executing the effect, since it denotes the immediate principle of operation. But in God, all these things are one. The temple in Jerusalem, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which was God's original plan, but King David wanted to make a temple because he's dwelling in houses of cedar and God's in the tent. But God says, when did I ever ask you to do that for me? But whatever, go knock yourself out. That's what you need. It's part of free will. So let's say, take the temple. In the temple, you have the Mishkan. You have the Mizbeach. You have the altar. The altar symbolizes the will, the heart. From the altar are given sacrifices, which are animals. Why are animals sacrificed? Because we have an animal nature. See how beautifully God has, from the very beginning, from Mount Sinai, given all the typology, all the semiotics necessary for you to understand yourself, if you could only look and see and understand. So notice that you have a Mizbeach. You have an altar, which is the heart. That's the reason why on the Mezbeach in the temple, they would pour water and wine in 2 holes, which would flow underneath the altar and go out the Shar Maim, the water gate, and pour out of the temple. And then the prophecy is that from that gate will flow the water and wine that will at one point go up to the ankles of the people, and then finally the knees of the people, and finally the waist, and finally overwhelm the whole earth with this water and wine. That is why when John saw water and wine coming out of the side, which would have been the right side, which was the right side of the temple where the Shar Maim was, the water gate, he saw water and blood pour forth from the side of Mashiach. That's why he said, believe me, these things that I say are true. I saw it myself, because he is showing that that prophecy is now fulfilled, that from the heart, from the Mizbeach, from the altar, flow forth water and wine, and that mercy will fill up the whole earth. That's what St. John is referencing. I'm just saying this to show to you, to give you a proof, in case you doubt it, that the altar is the heart. The animals are burnt on the altar. Why are animals burnt on the altar? Because you have an animal nature that wants to go and eat grass and poop and procreate and do all these things, but without a higher knowledge. Those things in you must be sacrificed and then put on your heart. When they are not sacrificed but allowed to roam freely in an animal-like way, then they become like the people you see at Kroger. And it's a very sad thing. But if those things are sacrificed, then they are now, instead of being your destruction and your thing pulling you down, they become a fiery, burning light that ascends, actually. Instead of pulling you down, your animal nature ascends on the altar. And then what happens? Then they take the ashes and the coals of that altar and they bring it within the temple proper. And they put it on the second Mizbeach, which is the altar of incense. That fire burns the incense, which is the intellect. And that goes up forth before the veil. The veil is heaven, that part that is beyond our view and experience in this world. So where does the fire for the intellect come? It comes from the Mizbeach. So see the interplay between intellect and will. The intellect is guiding the will, but the fire for the intellect comes from the will, from the heart. The fire from the coals of the outer Mizbeach is what burns the incense from the inner Mizbeach that goes forth before the Ark of the Covenant and the blood of the Lamb, which is beyond the veil. Therefore, you have to see this interplay. That's why I'm telling you all of this, because Thomas is saying that God's intellect is coming from his heart. So you might say, well, wait a minute, I thought the intellect guided the heart. There's an interplay between this. These things are not so simplistic. They are absolutely simple, but they are not so simplistic to explain in our world because everything's divided. Skia, science. Science is taking everything apart to understand how it works and then bringing it back together. The temple is taking everything apart so that you can see how everything works and see how it can come together as one and get some vague inclination of what the deity is. But in the deity, all these things are one. The last thing I will say is on the Mizbeach in the temple, it wasn't just a straight square, but it was a square that went down, and then there was another layer, another square. And that's called the foundation. Foundation is yesod. The Hebrew word for foundation is yesod. And yesod is the part of the Kabbalistic tree of life, which corresponds to the human genitals. So you can see through this, what God's trying to show you is that your sexuality is actually one with your heart. And when you break your sexuality, you are breaking your own heart, and you will make improper sacrifices on your altar, and it will not work right. And that will affect how the coals cannot go to your intellect, and your intellect will be all wacky. And again, you see the people in Kroger. Article 5, whether any cause can be assigned to the divine will. Objection 1. It seems that some cause can be assigned to the divine will. For Augustine says, who would venture to say that God made all things irrationally? Again, they're taking these words, which are in our realm, this realm of skia, science, division, and he's failing to see, even though he's been told through the whole breadth of this book, that in God all these things are one, but he's asking about it in the way that it works with us broken, with we who are broken, humanity. So he's misunderstanding this. Same thing over and over again. But to a voluntary agent, what is the reason of operating is the cause of willing. Therefore, the will of God has some cause. You can just take that little temple thing that I just said, click it, and just listen to it over and over, because that explains everything that's being said here. God was very clear in the temple. Everything's already been said on Mount Sinai. Jesus came and made it even more clear with his life, but it's all the same thing being said over and over again. The Mount Sinai revelation was the second most important thing to happen in human history. The most important thing was the fulfillment of all of the things in the temple, which was the death and resurrection and Passover of our Lord. Objection 2, further. In things made by one who wills to make them and whose will is influenced by no cause, there can be no cause assigned except by the will of him who wills. But the will of God is the cause of all things, as has been already shown. If then there is no cause of his will, we cannot seek in any natural thing any cause, except the divine will alone. Thus all science would be in vain, since science seeks to assign causes to effects. This seems to be inadmissible, and therefore we must assign some cause to the divine will. Thomas is going to answer all these objections later, and we'll get to that tomorrow. Objection 3, Further, what is done by the willer on account of no cause depends simply on his will. If, therefore, the will of God has no cause, it follows that all things made depend simply on his will and have no other cause. But this also is not admissible. Well, we're going to find out that it quite is admissible, fellas, when we get to the respondio. But said contra, the argument from authority says, Augustine says, every efficient cause is greater than the thing affected. You have a first cause, an efficient cause, a formal cause, and a final cause. The efficient cause is the very first mover, the very first act. And that first act is God himself. And that act is one, intellect and will being one. But nothing is greater than the will of God. We must not then seek for a cause of it. The will of God is love and goodness, even though it doesn't always feel like it. This is All Straw. Have a wonderful day, everyone.